All right, what's going on, everyone? I got a couple things lined up here in the next couple weeks that I hope you like. I'm trying to pull in some subject matter experts in certain areas to kind of fill in some of the mini gaps that I just can't speak to when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I think we're going to start with an operator and trainer from the Patriot missile system that here in the United States, get a better idea of the system's capabilities, training timeline, maybe how it could be employed in Ukraine. But for today, I wanted to get into some recent strikes in civilian areas of Ukraine, ammo shortages, maybe on both sides, a potential peace summit in February, as well as President Zelensky's trip to the United States and his speech to Congress. First off, there were no major attacks in Ukraine on Christmas Day, at least that I saw or heard of. There were reports of continued fighting at quite a few areas all across the front, so I don't mean to suggest that the entire war went quiet. I mean, there were plenty of soldiers that were huddled cold in a trench all day, dodging artillery fire. But you never really know how like a Christmas Day in war is going to play out. I mean, throughout history, you can find all sorts of examples of a informal truce or ceasefire all the way through to a surprise attack because that's when the enemy is least expecting it. Now, there were some notable strikes on Christmas Eve. Russia fired artillery rounds into Kherson City, which is now under Ukrainian control in the south. The most recent updates I've seen from that strike are that 10 civilians were killed with 55 wounded, which means that it was more than one or two rounds fired that day. Now, most of these recent attacks that kill or wound civilians are coming from long range missiles or drone strikes against Ukrainian cities, really pretty far from the front. Big picture, electrical substations, power plants, transit hubs, things like that are targeted to reduce the Ukrainian ability to wage war. And with the location of these types of critical infrastructure being in and around populated areas, any attempt to hit those is inevitably going to lead to civilian casualties. Now, while many of these strikes end up being labeled terrorism, there are viable military targets in cities that have faced these drone and missile strikes. We're starting to dabble a little bit into total war here. It's contentious. I mean, look at the general response around the world when like Kyiv loses power for days at a time in the middle of winter. But there have been times throughout history where total war has been an effective strategy. What I'm getting at is that there is a strategy to striking civilian infrastructure, as that is typically what propels the war effort forward. It can be a risky move, but it is in the cards. However, targeting civilians simply to kill them, not much strategy there other than just producing fear. The shelling of civilian areas isn't new to this conflict, and it's something both sides have experienced. And by both sides, I don't mean Russian territory, but the people in Luhansk and Donetsk, some of the separatist regions after 2014, before the 2022 invasion, there has been shelling in some of those civilian occupied areas. Now, it's always hard to dial in exactly what happened in a situation like that. Generally, the receiving side will say that it's terrorism or the deliberate targeting of civilians, whereas the firing side won't really say much at all. I mean, if they are deliberately targeting civilians, they don't win any prizes for saying that out loud. And if they were trying to hit, say, a headquarters building or a military barracks but missed, that's also not something that you really want to announce publicly. But especially now with ammunition consumption becoming an area of concern, really for both sides, I'd like to think that randomly slinging shells into city centers is not going to be super prevalent going forward. Let's get into that though. Ammunition consumption and availability. From the very start of this war, Russia has had a substantial advantage in ammunition available. They have a larger military, larger stockpiles, so it really hasn't been a surprise that the artillery war has been as slanted as it has in Russia's favor so far. I mean, before NATO stock started to trickle in, Russia and Ukraine were using largely the same types of artillery pieces, but the volume of artillery fire coming from Russia was magnitudes beyond what Ukraine was firing. I mean, there were some portions of the line, especially in the summer, where Russia was outfiring Ukraine when it came to artillery by a ratio of 10 to 1. This is sometimes where the argument turns into quality versus quantity, with some folks saying that, well, Ukraine is using precision munitions, achieving first round effects on target, whereas Russia is peppering entire areas and never actually hitting anything. That's not really a good breakdown of the current state of the artillery war. Both sides have precision munitions, and both sides have been using vast amounts of dumb, unguided munitions like you would normally expect from traditional artillery. These two types of munitions are really used for different purposes. when and how certain types of artillery are preferred over others. Could be a good topic for a video, but for now at least, we're going to focus on ammunition consumption rates. This is quickly becoming something that both sides are having to keep an eye on. No surprise for the Ukrainian side. I mean, as far back as spring, I remember hearing that Ukraine was about to run out of artillery if the West didn't really pick up their shipments. However, I'm starting to see more and more reports and evidence that Russia is having to keep an eye on that as well. And it makes sense. I mean, midsummer, there were reports that Russia was firing up to 60,000 artillery rounds a day. A day. That comes out to around 2 million rounds a month. As a comparison, and I know this is apples to oranges to something else entirely, but the U.S. is currently producing around 14,000 artillery rounds per month. So 2 million rounds fired against 14,000 produced. I get it. I just compared Russian and Soviet stockpiles to current U.S. manufacturing, but hopefully it gives an idea at least of just how many rounds Russia was firing. That monthly volume is, I'm sure, something the U.S. could eventually get to, but would require some pretty serious steps, and it's certainly not going to happen next month. Now, that 60,000 a day number was pulled during kind of peak activity during the summer months when Russia was trying to hammer down Ukrainian positions all across the Donbass. It doesn't appear that the artillery rate of fire was quite that high leading up to the summer, and from reports, it also seems like it's quite a bit less now. Either way, with air power taking a back seat since the early days of the conflict, primary fires have come from artillery, and in turn, Russia's relied pretty heavily on it. There's a good article that I'll link in the description below by Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee talking about how Russia's reliance on overwhelming artillery fire during the summer may be costing them now and in the near future. In short, they may have used up a lot more ammunition than expected. I've had a hard time nailing down what Russian artillery production was before the war or what it is today. Maybe if you come across that, please let me know. But it would have to be around 70 times more than U.S. current production to kick out 1 million rounds a month, which is likely in the general ballpark for the average consumption so far in the war. That's a problem for Russia. And I think we're already starting to see the impact here. Reports as of late are that while Russia is still outgunning Ukraine in terms of volume of artillery, it's nowhere near what it was this past summer. And if we add in all the ammo dumps and supply points that were targeted by HIMARS as soon as they arrived in country, it's not crazy to think that Russia's having to conserve ammunition or possibly to change up their tactics to be less reliant on overwhelming artillery fires. I'm not saying that Russia is running out of artillery ammunition. I mean, I have no idea how big their stockpiles are. It does look like, however, they're starting to really keep an eye on how much artillery is being fired, whereas a few months ago, it was quite a bit more loose. All right, Peace Summit. This has very high possibility of clickbait. I'll show you why here in a second. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Kubela gave an interview to the Associated Press. I'll link that interview in the description below. This past, just a couple days ago, actually, where he said that Ukraine would like to have a peace summit, ideally hosted by the United Nations, sometime by the end of February. That's the big headline, right? Ukraine wants peace summit in February. Wait for the rest. Kubela adds that they don't anticipate that Russia would take part and that Russia needs to face a war crimes tribunal before Ukraine will talk directly with Moscow. So it's not hard to understand Ukraine's point of view when it comes to the desire to put Russia on trial, and who can blame them? But I can't imagine a scenario where that happens before peace talks between the two begin. Honestly, the pessimistic side of me wants to warn folks of the possibility of any war crimes tribunals ever happening. I mean, if Russia comes out on top, they're not going to voluntarily send their folks to The Hague. We wouldn't, haven't. And on the other end of the spectrum, I can hear the argument now that a beaten down Russia shouldn't be punished even more. That we need to focus on bringing them back into the international community rather than hunting down leaders and soldiers, forcing everyone to relive the horrors of the war. That doesn't mean that it's right or that something shouldn't be pursued. Just, we let a lot slide after World War II. All right, last item here is Ukrainian President Zelensky's visit to the United States. This was his first trip outside of Ukraine since the war began. He went to D.C., met with President Biden, gave a speech in Congress, and I'll put a link to that video of that speech below. It was pretty impressive. I mean, say what you will about the guy, and I know he elicits strong emotions from both sides of the spectrum in this conflict, but he's done a pretty good job, in my opinion at least, of speaking to the audience directly in front of him. He knows who he's talking to, right? Real quick, this picture here is a Valor Award that was presented to a Ukrainian soldier that commands one of the U.S. supplied HIMARS to Ukraine. So that soldier gave the award back to Zelensky, asking that he brought it to the United States and gave it to Biden as a thank you from he and his men. All right, a few notable lines that stood out to me, at least, from Zelensky's speech. He said, quote, "Against all odds and doom and gloom scenarios, Ukraine did not fall. Ukraine is alive and kicking, and it gives me good reason to share with you our first joint victory. We defeated Russia in the battle for minds of the world. We have no fear, nor should anyone in the world have it. Ukrainians gained this victory, and it gives us courage, which inspires the entire world. Americans gained this victory, and that's why you have succeeded in uniting the global community to protect freedom and international law. Europeans gained this victory, and that's why Europe is now stronger and more independent than ever." Later he said, quote, "Our two nations are allies in this battle, and next year will be a turning point. The point when Ukrainian courage and American resolve must guarantee the future of our common freedom, the freedom of people who stand for their values." He ended the speech by giving a flag signed by Ukrainian fighters in Bakhmut to the vice president and Speaker of the House. I don't think that the subsequent aid package to Ukraine was really a risk of not being sent pending this visit, but Zelensky certainly did his part to petition for the continuation of aid as well as the consideration for more advanced weaponry. There are other folks much better suited to get into kind of the U.S. domestic political aspect of ongoing support for Ukraine. But to me, at least, even though there are a handful that are rather outspoken against the idea of providing aid to Ukraine, it does look like the vast majority of government leadership isn't slowing at all in their resolve. That could always change, but at least for the next few months, I think it's safe to say that the U.S. aid to Ukraine is really at no risk of slowing. All right, that's all I got for now. I'll see y'all next time.